The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Our aim is to explore the fringe, lost civilizations, alternative science, the paranormal, and much more. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live or future guests via email or the live chat room. And remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? I am your host, Soraya, and this week we have something I think is going to be very entertaining. We're going to be talking with Jim Harold, and let's see. You there, Jim?
I am here.
All right, and you are located where, Ohio?
I am in the northeastern Ohio region around Cleveland, and so glad to be with you tonight, though, up in Ithaca.
Well, good to have you, and you do a bunch of stuff. You have a couple of books out, and you do is it a weekly podcast?
Well, I do a couple of weekly podcasts.
Okay.
One is called the Paranormal Podcast, which is the one that I started out with, where I interview authors and experts about the paranormal and the supernatural. And my other podcast, that podcast I started in 2005. And this other podcast I started in 2009. It's called Jim Harold's Campfire, where callers from all over the world call in and share their stories of the supernatural. And both of my books have been based on that particular podcast, and it's a lot of fun to do. And then I have a ton of plus material if you want to get into that, some other shows. But I steer new people to jimharold.com, and those two shows, it's free content. And so far, so good. People seem to like it.
All right. How did you get interested in the paranormal?
Well, really, it goes back. I'm in my mid-40s, and it goes back to In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. And I really loved the paranormal and had always been fascinated by it since I was a small kid. And also fascinated by technology and broadcasting. Went to school for broadcasting. And like so many people, ended up in the business, but I ended up in the business side of the business and not in front of the mic. And fast forward to 2005, I was in my mid-30s with a wife and two kids and said, oh, gee, that whole broadcasting dream, that's kind of by the boards, isn't it? And I heard about something called podcasting, and I said, well, heck, I can do it as a hobby, maybe not professionally, and decided to podcast on the paranormal because it is a genuine interest of mine and has been since I was a small kid in the mid-70s. So decided to do it. It kind of caught on, and now it's my full-time profession.
All right. And these books, both of these are compilations of stories people have told you.
Yes, absolutely. The most recent one is True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 270 spooky stories that will keep you up at night. And basically what I did is I took 50 or so episodes of the shows, and I culled out what I thought were the best stories and most compelling, at least to me. And everybody from people from Australia to New York to Ohio to Canada to the UK, all over the world that have had strange supernatural experiences. And that's what it's all about. And it's the story's pretty much in their words, lightly edited.
Okay, and you don't go through any way of verifying these. You kind of take them at face value, right?
That's right. I mean, there's no way, obviously, that, we have callers who call in basically anonymously. They'll use a first name. So I can't personally go out. I don't have the resources to go out and investigate the cases and see. But I will say this, is I did stress to pick, after a while of doing this, you get a sense if somebody's sincere or not. And I really do believe the vast majority of people that I've talked to and have these strange, unusual experiences, I think they're sincere. And I believe them. Let's put it this way. I believe that they believe something supernatural's had to happen to them. Is it necessarily so in every case? I can't say that, but I certainly believe that they believe it.
Well, that's a fair way of putting it. And that's kind of what matters in the end, is whether or not they believe what they're saying.
Right. And to be honest with you, I think that objectively, I think that many of these things have happened, because my whole view of the paranormal is that, I don't buy everything, and I certainly think you should keep an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. That being said, too many people across too many different walks of life have these kind of experiences. Even the skeptics, when I talk to the skeptics, people will say, well, I don't really believe in this stuff, but there was this one time. And then they proceed to tell you their ghost story or their sighting of a UFO or whatever it might be. So there's something going on. What it is, I really can't say, but certainly something's going on out there.
All right. Well, do you want to tell us some of your favorite stories out of some of these that you've collected?
Well, I know that we've talked about a couple of them before the show started. I want to start out with one, though, that I think is certainly one of my favorites and one of the weirder stories in the show. And this is called The Nightmare Before Elm Street. And I absolutely love this. This goes back to a man, Frank from Colorado. And the story begins in 1961. He was about 5 years old. And he had this horrible nightmare. Now, he lived with his mom. His dad was in the service. From the story, I believe this was kind of military housing. His dad was serving the country. He was there with his mom. And he had this horrible, horrible dream. He's about 5 years old, 1961. Keep that date in mind. It comes into play later. And he wakes up. And basically, to recap the dream, he's dreaming that this... he's in his backyard, and out there's like a hillside, and outside the hillside comes this man kind of in this dark coat, and he has knives on the end of his fingers, and he's chasing him. And just as he's about to catch him and kill him, the little boy, he wakes up. So anyway, he wakes up, and he shares a room with his 4-year-old sister. And he says, go get Mom, I can't move my legs. And sure enough, now this is back in the day when they had doctors who made house calls. And so the doctor comes out and says, well, who scared this child? And the mom says, nobody scared him. He just had a horrible nightmare. He could not move his legs, and he could not move his legs for several days. And over the course of a few days, his grandmother, who lived in the area, would come over and kind of do rudimentary physical therapy and manipulate his legs. And he eventually was able to walk again and move his legs. And he would have this recurring dream throughout his adolescent years. It would never get to the point where the figure was going to kill him. But he would also get sick when this would happen. He would get a fever. So he also always associated it with illness and being sick. So anyway, where the story really gets weird is 1988. This gentleman had a friend. They would go walking in the morning and things. And the friend said, hey, you ought to check out this really scary movie. It's a really good movie. And gave it to him on VHS, if anybody out there remembers VHS video cassettes. And he took it and he popped it into his VCR. And he says, when he saw the figure, the main protagonist, I guess, or antagonist of the movie, he almost had a heart attack. It turned out to be Freddy Krueger, who perfectly mimicked exactly the character that he saw in his dream in 1961, I might add.
Wow.
And he said he almost told his mother that he thought that if the character had caught him, that he would have killed him. And he essentially lived that movie over 20 years before it was made. Now, what I found out later, after the book has come out, people have told me that there was, in some Asian cultures, people dying in their sleep. And that's what Nightmare on Elm Street was based on. And I know that this man had Japanese lineage. His mom was Japanese, he said. So I don't know if there's any correlation there, and I don't know the specifics of the origins of the story, but I've been told by several different people that there are some true stories that the Freddy Krueger character was based on. So I just thought that was really, really compelling and interesting, and really a spooky way to start our discussion now tonight.
Absolutely. And I wonder where Wes Craven came up with the actual imagery for it.
Yeah, I don't know that. That would be an interesting question. But imagine, having this nightmare that haunted you for almost 30 years, and then to turn on your television and see the figure that you had a nightmare about. Pretty spooky.
Yeah, to say the least. And that one's in your new book, right?
Yes, and tonight the stories, mainly the stories that we probably would talk about, would be about my new book, Jim Harold's Campfire, True Ghost Stories, and it's number 2, Campfire 2. And actually, if you were going to start out, I would actually recommend this one. Both are standalone books. They have this book has 70 stories. The other book has about the same amount. But I'd recommend this one because I'm a little biased, but I like this book better. And you can get this book on Kindle. It's very inexpensive. I think it's $3.99 right now for a full-length book. And then it's under $9 in paperback on Amazon as well. So it's very economical, particularly as we're going to the holidays. If somebody wants a stocking stuffer for somebody who likes spooky stories, we think this is a good buy.
And it's a good, easy read, too.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it's a great bathroom reader. Nice short story.
And are they all basically ghost stories?
No, actually, I mean, it's sometimes it's hard to do a title to a book because you want to put so many disclaimers that actually you'd end up writing the great American novel on the cover. But it's the plurality of the stories are ghost stories, but there's also a few UFO stories in there. There's some just almost cryptozoology stories. And then there's some ones that are really not categorizable.
Kind of like the Freddy one.
Yeah, like the Freddy one. Here's another one that I really like that's not really a true ghost story, but it does really make you think. It's called The Plane That Killed Me. And this is another thing I love about the show is the international nature of the show. And in particular, this comes from Michelle in the UK. And she had 2 sons. And at the time of the story, her oldest son was 3 years old, and they were sitting in a dining room. She said it was a lovely summer day, and the window was opened into the back garden, as they say over there. And they heard a biplane fly over. Now, obviously, a biplane is kind of the World War I dual-wing type plane, Red Baron, that kind of thing. And they heard it. They lived near an airport, and they heard it. And all of a sudden, she said her 3-year-old piped up and said, "Oh, that sounds like the plane that killed me." And she said, "Really?" And she said he was extremely blasé about it, very matter of fact. He said, "Yeah, you remember when I had another mom? I was a man and I was called Stephen." And she said, okay. She didn't want to lead him on. She wanted to kind of see where he went with it, didn't want to guide him in any way. Mm-hmm. So he said, "Oh, yes. I used to live with my mom in London. My girlfriend used to come around and we would all go down to the pub on the corner." And I love this part where he said, remember what he said, "You remember when I had another mom, I was a man and I was called Stephen." So obviously he was recalling something other than his current existence. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Yeah, we were sitting in the front room of my mom's house and we were listening to the radio and all of a sudden it went boom and there was blood everywhere," he said. Oh, and he was sort of flailing his arms as he was saying this. And Michelle was just amazed. He was coming out so matter-of-factly with it. Now, she says that it's very hard when a child's telling you something like that not to want to ask really pertinent questions. She said it could lead you down the wrong route. They'll start making things up, so it's really difficult. But now in hindsight, she wished she had asked a couple of questions so she could have gone and researched the story. Yeah. Now, he never mentioned again. And he's totally forgotten about it. He's 24 years old now, but Michelle says that it's something that she'll never forget. So we'll never know the truth. But a 3-year-old, where would that come from? I just don't know where that would come from.
And was it Ivan Sanderson who collected stories like that back in the 70s?
I believe so, yes.
Because, I mean, it's one thing to be hypnotically regressed to a past life. I mean, there's a lot of argument over how reliable hypnosis can be.
Yeah, they implanted memories or something like that.
Or the person's just making it up, unintentionally in the hypnotic state. But, I mean, when a child comes forth and gives you detailed information that they couldn't have known, it's even hard to imagine they could have made it up.
Right, because who would think about it? There would not be the connections or the reference or the context to put all that together. I wouldn't think. I mean, obviously, maybe he could have watched some old war movies or something, but it doesn't seem like there's any rational explanation for it.
Yeah, unless maybe he was someone else in a past life.
And that seems to be the most rational explanation for it, actually.
I do think that the spontaneous recall of kids is probably one of the best pieces of evidence for reincarnation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, I've never been a big reincarnationist, if that is a word. I mean, my background was a more of the Christian faith. So I've not gravitated towards reincarnation in particular. But boy, that certainly makes a good case for it. That particular story, many like it.
Yeah, yeah. And there's I believe, a documentary you can find on YouTube called "The Boy That Lived Before," if I'm not mistaken.
Ooh, that sounds like a good one.
And that was where they actually tracked the details of their young child's spontaneous recall, and he was a fighter pilot in World War II and went down the Pacific.
I'm familiar. Yeah, I'm familiar with this particular story, yeah.
So, and that what they actually got details, and apparently he had a breakdown when they got him to where he died, and then he just kind of forgot about it after that.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, again, you have to wonder what's explaining this, yeah. And again, even if it's against kind of what for example I grew up with, you have to really think about it when you hear these kind of stories.
Yeah, it's not proof, but it's one of the more likely explanations. I mean, maybe they're picking up something psychically from the ether and relaying it.
That's possible. I think that could be possible. And again, I do think that we have a tendency, and me included, that you tend to see what you want to see, or it's like when you look at the sky and you see, and it's funny, there's a couple of stories in the book like this, but very striking. But you see a cloud and it's shaped kind of like a dog, and you say, oh, it's a dog. I mean, you kind of see what you want to see sometimes. But boy, I just, a story like that really kind of hits home.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any UFO stories in the book that you'd like to relate?
Sure. Well, this is actually it's not a traditional UFO story, but there's two stories just like it, kind of like just actually it was one of the stories I was just referring to, and I would be very interested because I wonder if this ventures into the area of something like military experimentation or those type of things. Now, this story comes from Lisa from Indiana. She says this is a short story, but she doesn't think she's ever heard anything like it before. It was about 30 years ago, and she was with her family at Daytona Beach on vacation. Her dad, her brother, and Lisa, they were walking on the beach. It was late afternoon, and they said they had just arrived at the place they were staying, and they were looking around. And there were all kinds of clouds out over the ocean, and they were talking about how beautiful they were. And she said she looked up, and one of the clouds looked like a castle. And she said she didn't mean, it kind of looked like a bunny. It looked like a real castle made of clouds. She said, I could see every brick. I could see chains on the drawbridge. I could see the shape of the windows. It was amazing. She said, I didn't know what it was. She says she doesn't know what she was seeing. She said the thing of it was her brother asked, do you see that? And she said, heck yeah, I see that. What is it? She said, we stood there and looked at it for a long time, and my dad didn't really act like he saw it. My brother and I just stood there with our mouths open for a little while, and we just kind of went on about our business. She said she thought about it a lot over the years, and her brother remembers it too. She says it was beautiful, and I don't know what it was that we were seeing or why we may have been seeing it. It was definitely different. She says she wonders if anybody else has ever experienced anything like it. And I won't get into the specifics, but we have a story 2 or 3 chapters later in the book almost identical. And what I'm wondering is that in those cases, and I've heard of this before, I think there have been some military experiments on trying to put figures and things in the sky, possibly to scare enemy combatants during the heat of battle, and I'm wondering if they just happened upon one of those military experiments.
Yeah, very well could be, because I've heard that too. That where they were trying to project images of religious figures and stuff into the sky.
Yes,
it could also just have been a very odd optical illusion, I suppose.
But the thing that gets me about that is that the specificity and the detail that she describes. Yeah. It wasn't. It vaguely looked like a castle. It looked exactly like a castle. You could see the chains in the drawbridge and the bricks and so forth. So that's what kind of made me think, maybe this was something a little different than just, seeing a doggy in the sky.
Maybe a view into another world.
Maybe.
Huh. Yeah, that one's hard to rationalize, really.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And that's the way with a lot of these stories. I mean, again, I guess you could chalk it up to coincidence. One that we were talking about earlier is called Campfire Spirits.
Yeah.
And it's about a man in Canada. And he said a few years back, he and his wife were very into backpacking. So this particular time, this is up in Banff, Alberta, near Lake Minnewanka, if anybody's familiar with that. And they were going to do a 2-night trip, hike out to the campsite and go to a place called Elmer's Pass. And then afterwards, they'd hike back down to the camp, spend another night, and then hike out and go home. Now, they hit the trail at about 10 a.m., got to the campsite at 4 or 5 p.m., said nothing was up. Everything was pretty normal with the hike and so forth. He said there was nobody at the campsite. It was desolate and barren, and only for people who are big into backpacking. He said the next campsite was between 12 and 15 kilometers away, so they were pretty much by themselves. So they cooked dinner, and the campsite had kind of a heavy feeling to it, he said. The atmosphere was very oppressive. He said it was even subversive. He said they had their dinner and they went to bed, and neither of them were feeling in the mood for having a fire or anything like that. So just very utilitarian. They ate and went to bed. The next morning, he said, they got up and decided together that they weren't going to hike to this Elmer Pass, that they were just going to hike out and go home. He said that neither of them had talked prior to deciding this. They just kind of decided collectively at the same time, you know what, we're going to go back home. And he said, as we were eating breakfast, my wife looked over to me and she said, did you hear children last night? And he looked at her and said, yeah. And then the stories came out and they matched perfectly. He said that they both fell asleep about 10 p.m. the previous night, and both of them woke at about 2 or 3 a.m. Neither of them knew the other one was awake, of course. So this was independently that they were having this experience. And then he says the first thing he heard were the sound of fires in the background, like cooking fires, with things sizzling on them. It sounded like someone was roasting something over the fire. He said he heard women laughing and talking in the background, and he heard children running around their tent. He said, I couldn't see anything in terms of shadows, but I could hear them running. They were laughing and giggling. He describes it as very Blair Witchy. He said he was lying awake in bed and he heard these kids running around back and forth. He heard women laughing and talking away from the tent. And he said that they were pretty close to the beach of the lake, and there were a lot of pebbles there, and you could hear the water and the waves and everything rush in. And he said in between each wave you could hear footsteps, quite heavy footsteps on the pebbles, stomping along. He said they were very distinctive. He said his wife and he had heard exactly the same thing that night, even though neither one knew it at the time, and neither one knew the other one was awake listening to this. He said they both fell asleep about 4 a.m., and then they both had similar dreams of massive fires everywhere in the forest. He said it was unreal how they were sharing stories at breakfast and completing each other's sentences. They had no idea what had happened that night. They got up in the morning. Nothing was disturbed, but the oppressive feeling was even worse. And that's when they said, you know what, forget it. We're just going to take off. We're going to go back. He said on their way back, they were discussing what had happened that night. And they said that area is where the native peoples of that land would go hunting, and they would set up areas around there just for temporary camps. He said the men would go off to hunt, and the women would fish and gather. And he said that this experience really smacked of that he heard the children running around. They heard the women talking in the background and cooking things on fires. He said it was like someone had set up a camp around their tent in the middle of the night, and it was just bizarre. Now, they discussed the idea that might have been some kind of psychic recording of past events.
Right.
He thought that it seemed pretty plausible considering the history of the area. But the only thing about that was this oppressive, dark feeling that they got. And you would think that if it's just kind of like the stone tape theory, right, you would just think it would be kind of neutral. But they got this really nasty, nasty, unfriendly feeling. Again, he says it's Blair Witchy. He said you would think that hearing children laughing would be a positive thing, but it wasn't. Now, here's another thing that's kind of interesting. On their way in, they had crossed a stream about 500 meters from the campsite, and it was quite a large stream. And afterwards, they decided, we're going to pack up our stuff. We're going to get out of here. And they figured out they fill their water bottles up at the stream. They started to walk by, and when they got there, the stream was absolutely bone dry. Now, he said it could have happened overnight where whatever runoff had changed course or whatever, but the stream was big before. It was quite large. And he said that they both got wet crossing it, and now it was gone. He said seeing something change like that physically on the landscape was very, very strange. He said they were thirsty. They were actively looking for the stream, and they could not find it. Now, he seems to say, this is Craig from Canada, that he had thought about going back. His wife says absolutely not. So he decided to not do that, and he says he's just as happy leaving well enough alone. But that would be a very weird feeling to be in your campsite, to be in your tent camping, and then to hear what sound like native peoples gathering around your tent. That would be kind of spooky.
I'm surprised neither of them popped their head out of the tent.
Maybe it's a good thing they didn't.
Maybe. When you talk about the oppressive feeling, I always think of what John Keel said about extra low frequency waves sometimes having that effect on us. Mm-hmm. And
I've always been... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I've always been interested, though, in this idea of a stone tape theory.
Yeah.
The idea of, for example, I was just at, and I didn't see anything there, but I was just at a large train station that's been repurposed in a major American city. And I thought about the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who had been there. Some of the, this was probably a place dating back to, I've got to guess, the 30s. So you think about some of the emotions when, trains were the number one way to get around the country, probably people leaving to go to war. So, sadness and then happiness of people being renewed, all the emotions that are replayed. And I thought to myself, boy, that would be a perfect place for some manifestations if there is, in fact, something to that stone tape theory.
And do you want to explain to people who maybe aren't familiar with that what exactly it is?
Well, I'm probably not as well qualified to explain it as some, but I'll do my best. Okay. Basically, the idea is that in a given place, when you see manifestations, apparitions, and so forth, hear sounds and those kind of things, that the physicality of the actual structure is somehow capturing the psychic energy of past people who may have lived there or whatever, and just replaying it. And if I understand the theory correct, it's not necessarily spiritual. It's just like a tape that's not erased.
And certain types of stone are more likely to do this than others. Yes.
And that's always kind of fascinated me. And also the other thing, and this is borne out by some of the stories that we've had over the last, has it been now 4 or 5 years on the Campfire? Certain places seem to have more reports. Hospitals, prisons, theaters.
Places where there are high emotion.
Exactly. You think about, because theater, you think, well, what's the emotion there? Well, you've got these actors every night pouring their heart out, whether it's comedy or drama or whatever it might be. So these places, and there seem to be a lot of reports from these kind of places, so it makes you think if there's something to that. So I've always found that theory appealing.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. There was a kind of a weird movie made about it back in the 60s or 70s, too.
Yeah, I don't know the name of that particular movie.
I think it might be called the Stone Tape Sessions or something to that
I'll
effect.
Have to check that out because I that's one that's always appealed to me. I've not that I'm ruling out some kind of spiritual connection. I'm not, but I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't explain everything that people see, but it's certain areas where you get the repeated sort of almost like a playback of events.
And the thing is, and again, maybe it's because I'm conditioned towards it, or I think about when I walk into some place historical, it's been around for a long time. It's almost like you can feel it. Now, again, it could be all in my head.
Oh, sure.
but I don't know about you, but when I walk into a place like that, historic like that, you just get a different feeling. It's picking up on something.
Yeah.
And love the historical stuff. And that even gets into questions. Can spirits haunt artifacts? Yes. For example, I have an old pocket knife that belonged to my grandfather. And every time I see or touch that, I, in a sense, I feel him. Now, again, that could be mental on my part, but maybe there's actually something to it.
Yeah, it could be. We got to take a quick 45-second break. When we come back, maybe you can get into some stories about haunted artifacts.
All right.
Okay, we'll be right back with Jim Harold.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And tonight on Where Did the Road Go, we've been talking with Jim Harold, and he's been, entertaining us with a bunch of ghost stories, which aren't quite ghost stories. Only a few of them have been.
Yes. Well, you were talking about artifacts before.
Yes.
And this is not really a haunted artifact, but an inanimate object. There is one that I can tell you that, but I've got this one pulled up. So I'll tell you this one, and then we'll go back to the artifact. But this has an inanimate object involved in it, which I think is a pretty good story. It's called She Left a Message at the Beep. And our hero in the story, our protagonist, is Jay from Texas. And he said that he had been very fortunate. His grandparents had lived up until his 20s. And he had one particular grandmother who he's very close to. And she had a nickname for him, which was J-Boy. And nobody other than her and his dad ever called him this name. Now, one morning while he was at work, he got a call from his dad. And he had said that his grandma had had a heart attack, but that she had been revived and she was fine. And that they'd taken her initially to one hospital, and they were going to take her to a little more sophisticated hospital, but everything was going to be fine. She gave him a thumbs up from the back of the ambulance. Everything was good. So Jay asked her dad, should I come home? Is she okay? Are you sure? He's like, she'll be fine. Don't worry about it. So anyway, he's sitting at work, and all of a sudden he just breaks down. He tells his boss, I've got to go. And he said, what's wrong? He said, something's wrong with my grandmother. She had this episode earlier, but I don't know. Something's wrong. Now, he came home, and he was extremely distraught. And he had been home about 30 minutes, and this is before cell phones. So he said his dad actually drove up to his house and said, J-Boy, Ma died. And she had passed away as they were pulling into this other, more sophisticated hospital, and it was very traumatic for Jay. So a few days went by, and he had one of those old-fashioned answering machines. It sounds funny to say now, old-fashioned, but old-fashioned answering machines at the time that had blinking lights. If you had one message, the light blinked once, two messages twice, and so on and so forth. Now, I got home from work one day, and there were 3 messages on the machine. And as he said, it had been several days since his grandmother had died. Now, there have been multiple messages left on the machine since then, and they were fairly lengthy. He pushed play, and the first message was a hang-up, the first of 3. And the second message was a salesperson or something along those lines. And the third message was his grandmother's voice, and she said, I love you, J-Boy. He said it stopped him dead in the tracks, and he turned around and he pushed play again because he wanted to hear it again. First message was a hang-up. Second message was the salesperson, and there was no third message.
Wow.
He said her message was very comforting to me. It also told him that he needed to watch his P's and Q's because his grandmother could still see what he was doing.
Huh. It's go on.
It just makes you think.
Yeah. Well, it's always weird when telephones are involved for some reason. It always seems a little creepier. There was always that old Twilight Zone episode with the
oh, yes, Billy Mooney, yes.
Yeah.
Grandma, he's calling, yeah. That's really a creepy one. I love that one.
Yes,
now,
yes, indeed.
Speaking of creepy, you were asking before the break about haunted objects.
Yes.
And this is the first chapter in the book. It's called The Reclining Ghost. And this was about a decade ago, and I assume that our caller at that time was like a teenager. And her mom had a friend who wanted to get rid of some furniture. So my caller says, hey, who doesn't want free furniture? So she went with her brother and her mom to this woman's house. Now, her husband was this woman's house they went to. They were an older couple, and the husband was in his late 80s, and he was still alive. He had a couple of recliners, a couple of dressers that they were giving away. Now, the man told our caller's mom very directly, you can have these recliners, but only you can have them and nobody else. So our mom said, okay, no problem. A couple of months or so after they got the recliners, the man passes away. And after his death, weird things started to happen with one of the recliners specifically. Our caller said she would remember being in the living room, and sometimes when she'd be by herself, she'd hear something moving around, and she would make a joke, and she would tell what she perceived as a ghost. If you drop anything, you're picking it up because I'm not getting up from here and picking it up. You made the mess, you pick it up. Now, the recliner in question was put into her brother's room. All of a sudden, he started to having health problems. He had appendicitis. He had deep depression. He had to have a surgery. Everything worked out, but trouble seemed to follow this particular recliner. Now, after a year or so, they got rid of this particular recliner and gave it to the elder sister of the family who had her own family and lived elsewhere. She got the recliner and put it in her son's bedroom. And this boy would say that sometimes at night he would see the chair move. He would see a hand come across the resting arm area and tap its fingers. He told his mom, there's this arm. I'm seeing this thing. I don't like it. What is it? And she didn't believe him. She said, just ignore it. You're just tired. You're stressed from school. But he insisted that he was seeing something. So one night it happened again, and this time he went to his mom's room, and he refused to go back to bed. He said, I'm not going back in there. And to reassure him, she offered to take the chair and put it in her room to show him there's nothing to this. So nevertheless, a couple of days later, they went to bed. She started to hear something. She looked at the chair and saw the chair moving. And she started to see an apparition of an arm come up, just as the boy had said. And it was starting to tap its fingers, and it started to become a weird demonic form. Now, at this point, it freaked her out so much that she grabbed the chair, put it out onto the curb in the middle of the night to get rid of it permanently. She went back in the house, slammed the door, said, good riddance. She hears something rocking back and forth in a dragging sound. She thought maybe someone had come across, saw the chair and wanted to take it, a garbage picker. She decided, her and her son, to look out the window, and they got a shock. They saw the chair rocking and dragging itself along the curb. And she said she saw what looked like a figure. And she said there were these weird spirits just jumping out of the thing. She said, I just closed the windows and everything. I didn't want to open the window or crack it open or anything. I didn't care. And after that, Jeannie from Washington doesn't know what happened to the chair, but they never saw it again. That would make me think twice about used furniture.
Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't go out and set it on fire.
Yeah, that's a spooky one.
Yes, it is. And it seems to be a bit of a negative one, too, there with the demonic forms.
Well, that's an interesting point because, most people, I think when they associate or think about the paranormal, they think it's all like that. It's all dark. It's all spooky. And I think that's certainly part of it. And sometimes, obviously, we just had Halloween. Part of the fun is the spookiness and the scariness. I tend to think of it as, let me go back and say this. I talk to a lot of New Age people on some of my shows. And I'll say, well, do you think there's anything such as evil? And they'll say, oh, no, Jim, that's just a lower spiritual evolution. I personally believe there's evil, and I believe there's good. And I think that the paranormal or the supernatural or whatever it is just like our everyday existence. You run into good stuff, like, Grandma telling J-Boy that she loved him, and you run into spooky stuff and everything in between, like evil spirits, like we just had in that last story. So I don't tend to think of the paranormal as something to be in toto afraid of, or in total just to think it's love and light. I think it's like life. There's good and there's bad. That's just my opinion.
I would agree with that, but I've also found that sometimes negative experiences may be trying to show you something or teach you something, and you're viewing it as negative at the time, but when you look back on it later, you go, oh, well.
Good point.
So.
And that happens in life, too. I mean,
oh, yeah.
I think about things that have happened to me. The only time in my life I was ever fired from a job, which I thought, oh, only bad people get fired, which I don't think is the case now after it happened to me. But, after a 20-year run in media, to only get fired once is actually a pretty remarkable record. But that directly, even though I went back and got another, full-time job working for the man, that kind of set me on the path to go full-time with all this. And if that had not happened, I wonder if I'd be doing this today. So sometimes the negative can actually work towards the positive.
True. And sometimes it might just be negative.
Yeah, that's true.
They may not. They may be seeing it, from their side, from the spirit side. They may not be necessarily negative, but they may be negative toward us.
And the other thing is, I think there is some, and this is a subject that freaks me out. I even hate to bring it up, but something like the jinn and those kind of things. I think there is a trickster element.
Yeah,
to all
absolutely.
Of this sometimes.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes there are spirits and things that just like to mess with us.
Well, yes, yeah. And again, sometimes for good and sometimes not so good.
Right.
And you get that with the UFO phenomena, too. I mean, the same type of thing. The trickster element is very heavy through there. Yeah,
I agree. And it's, again, into things like shape-shifting and showing you what you want to see. And, it makes you wonder. And one thing, and I've talked to people like Brad Steiger about this idea. It's not my idea. It's his idea and other people's idea of this grand unified theory, the paranormal. Is it all tied together? And the longer I do this, well, let me put it this way. When I first started, I thought in 2005, I thought this will be great. I'll do these shows for 6 months and I'll have this all figured out because I'll get to talk to all these great people. Well, not so much. But I will say this. I think I'm coming to more of a belief that it's all somehow tied together.
Yeah.
And again, and I've said this, and this also is not an original thought, that this may be, in fact, scientific, but it's just the science of the 24th century. And, for example, my favorite example is this. You mentioned ether before. Certainly that was accepted dogma way back when, and now not so much. On the other hand, something like DNA has always existed, but we didn't know it existed until relatively recently. So who's to not say that there is some kind of paranormal element to life, supernatural element, call it what you want, that we just don't get yet? That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that we don't have the instruments, the sophistication, the wherewithal to figure it out right now. Doesn't mean that it could never happen. Do I think it's going to happen in my lifetime? Probably not. But someday somebody will figure it out, I hope.
Well, with the wealth of paranormal stories and the stuff that can be proven to have actually happened, like you mentioned Peter Robbins. We have Peter Robbins coming on again next week, and the stuff at Rendlesham is a great example of things that we know this stuff happened. It's recorded. There's a decent amount of evidence. It's not someone's imagination, but we can't even begin to explain what happened there.
Well, it's interesting, and I can't remember where I heard this. I thought it was a brilliant observation. I don't even think it was on one of my shows. But they were talking about, proving the paranormal and why don't we believe people when they have ghost stories. And someone made the point, for example, we can't even objectively prove that we dream. I mean, we can hook electrodes to somebody's head and do a sleep study and see that something's going on in the brain and maybe, with some specificity. But we can't really say that, I dreamed that 3 purple elephants came chasing me down the road last night. We just assume that people are telling the truth when they say that. So the same is to be said about ghost stories. We can't objectively prove it, but does that mean it's absolutely not true in 0 cases? I think not. I mean, there should be something to be said for anecdotal evidence. I know anecdotal evidence is the worst evidence, and It's just like a crime scene. You know, if you ask people to do artist renderings and so forth, they woefully misdescribe. But it's the best that we got right now. You know. So I think that with all of these stories across cultures, I mean, and I see a little bit of this, although everybody I talk to pretty much is English speaking, but I talk to people in Canada and the U.S. and England and Australia and Canada. I talk to people in Japan, and the stories are the same. And again, it's not a drastic cultural difference, but I think that all cultures, pretty much it's been established, have ghost stories and stories of things that can't be explained. It seems to be a universal experience, and a lot of people say, well, it's just because of all these ghost shows that are on and all these UFO movies. But what about the Betty and Barney Hills of the world? Before, you know, there was a space-oriented movie every time you turned around, and ghost stories go way back before the invention of motion pictures. So certainly, while I agree that some people make stuff up, there's no question about that, or people
hoax it or
misinterpret things, and I will even say there are people with mental issues and things, certainly. But I also think another thing that's happened with the proliferation, specifically with ghost stories, for example, is that now people feel like they can tell these stories. Because years ago, they would tell them in family gatherings, you know, this happened to me. I saw Uncle Fred, but don't tell anybody. I'll get fired down at the factory. So I think that has a lot to do with it, too. So, you know, again, the proliferation of paranormal media, it's like most things in life. It's a double-edged sword. And I guess I include my shows into that as well. Will it increase hoaxers? Will it increase people who maybe have delusions and those kind of things? I would be willing to say that. But also, it also, I think, shines a light on people who have real experiences. And even if they never tell a story, you know, if they listen to my show and they never tell a story to me, or they listen to Coast and they never tell a story directly to Coast, but they might tell a friend, or they might tell someone, and those stories might live on. So I think overall it's a net gain.
Yeah. What do you think of the sort of ghost shows that are out there?
Surprisingly, I'm not a huge fan. I mean, I'm kind of old school.
Okay.
And I like the more kind of investigative, the kind of, you know, let's turn on the infrared lights and have a lot of green footage and run around and act scared. I'm not a big fan of. That doesn't mean that I think there isn't a place for ghost hunters. I just think that has been so templatized.
Yeah.
I mean, having had the little bit of background in media, you know, I am often, you know, people complain about the formats of radio stations, for example. And I said, well, quite frankly, if they could have the sound of somebody gurgling for 2 minutes and 30 seconds and sell commercials around it and make money, and people liked it, they would play it.
Sure.
And I think that's the way with the ghost shows. It's like, okay, this is the convention. This is how we treat the subject of the paranormal in 2013. We get a bunch of people in black clothing. We equip them with a bunch of gizmos, and then we show a lot of dark, grainy green footage and have them act freaked out. And that's how we do it. And it's the same thing, I got to say, on local television. You know, okay, there was a UFO sighting. Cue the X-Files music. Cue the anchor with the arched eyebrow. You know, this is the way we do it. And I don't think it could be some grand conspiracy, but I think it's just laziness and the rush to the lowest common denominator. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't watched all the ghost hunter shows. I know that's a particular brand, but the ghost hunting shows, I should say. So I can't really say each and every one of them are bad. I just, in general, that's not my thing.
Right.
It's funny because people think, because I do these shows, they say, well, are you a ghost investigator? Or they assume I'm a ghost investigator. I said, no. I said, do you assume somebody who does sports reporting, do you assume they play football or baseball? Not necessarily. I'm more of kind of a conduit, so people who do those sort of things can come on my shows and provide their theories, their explanations, or in the case of my Campfire show, provide their stories. So by no means am I casting aspersions to ghost hunters. I just not too crazy about the way the whole phenomena has kind of evolved over time. I kind of go harken back to those older shows where they treat it a little more seriously.
Well, I think you're right in the respect that they do give people a little more comfort in telling their own stories, because it is so much a part of popular media now.
Yes.
And I think even if these different ghost hunting shows start out with a genuine interest to research this stuff, at a certain point, ratings matter.
Well, I think what happens is, having been in media and so forth, basically you do what you're told, or unless you have power, unless you're a Howard Stern or you're somebody with big ratings, at that point you can tell the powers that be to an extent, pound salt, this is the way we're going to do it. But the average personality, particularly on these cable shows and so forth, they're basically, they may come into it with every good intention, and then the producer says, we need a little more, we need a little more fright in your voice. We need we need to cut this a little faster. We need to do this. And it kind of, what I'm thinking happens is that over time it morphs into something maybe less than what the person involved or the people involved wanted it to be, because their vision has been kind of distorted by the business people and the creative people that want to get it down to 43 and a half minutes and wanted to follow this particular kind of narrative because that's what tested well in focus groups.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but that is kind of how most media works.
Yeah, that's at least my experience. And I've not done a lot of outside media in terms of the paranormal, but just having worked in the media in general, that's exactly the way it works, because the guys in the offices really don't, for the most part, I don't think they really care what you're putting on there as long as it's getting the ratings. Again, they could have the sound of gurgling, as I said, and they put it on the air.
All right. Well, we're starting to run out of time. Do you want to tell people, do you have, I don't know if you've already told your favorite stories, but do you have a favorite out of all these?
Ooh, that's tough. That's like one of those, well, let me just hurry up with this one, because this is not just any painting. Okay, well, this is a story of a young man, broken home, and he lived with his mom, and she had a roommate and her child. And this was in San Francisco, and his mom had gone to a estate sale or something and picked up a painting of a woman in a rocking chair, beautiful woman in a rocking chair. So they brought this painting home, and weird stuff started to happen. They put it on the wall. It kept falling off the wall. And as they put it up, they noticed at night, when they first put it up, there was like quiet crying downstairs. They slept upstairs, and they were in this apartment, 2-story apartment. So anyway, I should say that the people that they bought the painting off of, they thought maybe they were kind of into the darker arts, as it were. So anyway, over a few weeks, this crying started to get louder and louder every night, until one night it became so intense, my caller said, that it shook the walls. The kids were in one room, the ladies were in another. They came to the kids' room. They took them out in their pajamas, didn't even bother to dress them, because it was so intense, again, crying and bawling of a woman. So intense that it was almost literally shaking the walls, my caller says. So anyway, they go downstairs. They don't go past our living room area because the way the layout is, and they go into the parking lot to get in the car. And from the parking lot, you could see they had like a patio door without a window treatment. They could see into the apartment. And what they saw shocked them. Remember that painting was of a kind of a blonde woman sitting in a rocking chair. Mm-hmm. They looked up. That woman was sitting in a rocking chair in their living room. Well, they never returned to the apartment, and
surprisingly,
I think they got rid of the painting. But that's one of my favorites from the book.
There was one I heard you tell about a bar that they had gone into.
Oh, that's not in the book. That'll be in the third book. But that's basically a time warp story. And well, I don't know if it's a time warp. Maybe it's more of an alternate reality. But that one is one where basically a woman and her friend come into this bar that should have been closed. because it was later than 2 o'clock in the morning. Place was hopping. Went in, got a beer, sat down. The reason they went is because she had to go to the restroom. Had a mural on the wall. And to make a long story short, they started to see two figures by the door kind of morph into this scene. And those two people ended up being them. They recognized themselves, and they said, let's get out of here. They closed the door, and there's a whole thing where they're very strange kind of people here. They close the door. The place shuts down like it's never been open. They start to leave. They realize there's no cars in the parking lot now. They all disappeared. So anyway, this woman goes back a few days later. Now, part of the story was there was an old jukebox with 45s there, okay? She comes back. There's a jukebox. It's a modern one with CDs. The bartender was a young guy, kind of strapping. When they come in, the bartender's a woman. He says, well, I was in here the other night at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a Sunday night. And she said, we close at 10:30 on Sundays. And, well, what about the bartender? Well, there's only two bartenders, me and my dad, who's like 60 years old. So it makes one wonder. I'm not giving justice to the story, but it makes one wonder if this person kind of got into the Twilight Zone, so to speak. And that will be probably in book 3. That's one of my favorites. Probably my favorite all-time campfire story.
Wow. Okay. And when does book 3 due out?
I'm hoping in the spring. I'm working feverishly. I'm hoping that I can get it out in the spring. We'll see how that goes.
All right. Well, when it comes out, we'll have to have you back.
Sounds good. I'd like to invite everybody to my website, jimharold.com, JIMHAROLD.com. You can find a link to the books and to the free podcast, the Paranormal Podcast, and the Campfire. If you've enjoyed these stories, we do a lot of that over there. And if you love interviews with paranormal movers and shakers, we do a lot of that too.
And there's also a show archive for 90 days, you said?
Yeah, you can listen to all of the shows 90 days back. I should say we're also on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn Radio, Roku, and everywhere fine podcasts are heard.
Nice. And you have a plus section as well.
Yeah, that's over at jimharold.net. If you listen to the free shows and really like it, you can check that out and get access to hundreds of shows going back to 2005.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. It's been great having you.